Sounded like you just said pants.
Chance, we turn the lights up, please. So we're going to move on and talk about Russia a little bit today. So we've been moving ourselves further and further toward the east, and we now get to the Empire of Russia, which at this point they're really not an empire. They're just in their infancy and beginning to grow as a community of people. So here we are, Roman numeral 3, and let's talk about the beginning part of Russia. We have to go back to the early Vikings and the Slavic people to really understand Russia's history. And I know last year in geography we talked a little bit about Russian history. We spent a good deal of time talking through some of these guys. Do you remember any of the names of people we talked about? Just remember one?
Well, I'm reading it right now.
Oh, you're reading it off your screen? Okay. Well, I guess I have to give you some points for initiative on that, digging and finding the research. But without using that, do you remember any of them? Vladimir was one of them, yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about Vladimir a little bit. So we didn't go real deep into it last year, but we'll talk a little bit more this year on this. So we begin here with the Vikings and Chief Rurik. And he kind of becomes one of the first leaders that we know about. I guess it would help if I turned this on, wouldn't it? Yeah. There we go. So the Vikings have a chief by the name of Rurik, and he's invited by the Slavs to come and to be their ruler in Russia. The Russian people were very disorganized. Many of them did not have a government established over them. A lot of them lived out in the middle of the wilderness. They had little villages pop up from time to time, but very little organization to their society. So the Vikings show up in their typical Viking way, and whether the Vikings actually were invited or invited themselves to govern this group of people, history is a little unclear. I tend to side with the latter argument that when the Vikings showed up, they said, hey, we're here, we're going to rule over you, just because of what we know about the Vikings. But according to legend, the Slavs were so enamored by the Vikings, they begged them to stay and to govern over them. Yeah. The first major city was founded in 862, and it was the city of Novgorod. I am not going to quiz you over the date, but that gives you a perspective in the timeline of events here, where we are in the European Middle Ages, and this is all happening in Russia at the same time. Their first major city was Novgorod, but it does not last long as their most prominent city. Very soon it is overtaken by the city of Kiev. And it becomes more prominent due to the fact that it is located on a river, and so therefore it has easier access to trade with other major cities. Those of you who had excelled at geography, where is Kiev located? It's the capital city of what country?
Ukraine.
Ukraine, good. Well done, you did. Excellent. So by locating that in modern-day Ukraine, we get a little perspective of where this is located. So, yep.
Does they change it to like Saint something? No, I'm not thinking of Moscow. I'm thinking of the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah. that
St.
one.
Petersburg changes names a number of times. You're right.
That's one of them.
I can't remember the last time it changed. I know it's not been too long, like within the last 100 years, but I can't remember.
It's like transgender.
So Kiev turns Orthodox. There was a leader in the city of Kiev. Her name was Princess Olga.
She looked like Jesus.
Princess Olga. Go for it. Go for it.
Child will get made fun of. Is it your one?
Now, so this is only the tipping point of some of the names that we will discover throughout the semester. So don't let them distract you too much. But I have to imagine what people are going to think about the names that we name some of our kids in our culture and society.
Oh, buddy.
But
Some
I
people
digress.
name their kids the weirdest thing.
Leaf?
Julia?
No. I know.
Elizabeth.
We
I
are
know, it's weird.
we are digressing. Let's talk Princess Olga. Now, the key thing, her claim to fame is that she converts the people of Kiev to Christianity.
Yeah.
And she unites them underneath a common religion. Ladies, let's refocus. Good, let's refocus. She unites them under a common religion for the very first time. And as time progresses, her grandson is Vladimir.
Vladimir Putin.
Well,
They're like Ivan the Great.
we'll get to him a little bit later. So, Vladimir is not sure about this whole idea of Christianity. He thinks maybe his grandmother was a little too quick to convert everybody to Christianity. Maybe we need to do a little more research. And so he sends teams of people all over the world to investigate different religious groups. And they have to write a 500-word summary with a PowerPoint and come back to report to him on all the major religions of the world. Oh, you're right. No, they didn't do that. But they did have to come back, and they did have to tell him all about what they found out. And as his teams go out, they were very much impressed by the Byzantine Christianity. They walked into the Hagia Sophia, and that building itself blew them away. They could not understand the architecture. They also were so amazed at the work that was put into it. They said, well, if they love their God this much to build something so crazy immense and so crazy beautiful, then this God must be awesome. And they come back and they tell Vladimir all about it. And so Vladimir converts them to Orthodox Christianity. And so they begin following the Byzantine variation of Christianity. Remember we talked about the split between the East and West Church? Well, this is where Kiev now and Russia becomes Orthodox Christianity, siding with the Eastern side. And even to this day, there's a lot of influence with Orthodox Christianity in that part of the world. So it would be important for you to link Vladimir with Orthodox Christianity in Kiev. So Vladimir takes Kievan Russia and he makes it into a major power in the eastern part of the world. So it's under his leadership. So Vladimir should have two things that you associate with him. First of all is Orthodox Christianity. Second thing is rising Russia to a eastern power. Well, he eventually passes off the scene, and he passes power off to his son, and his son's name was Yaroslav the Wise.
Olga and Yaroslav.
Yaroslav the Wise.
One more time, please. One more time, please.
Yaroslav the Wise.
Can you like slowly pronounce the first word?
Yaroslav.
When you say it like that.
You like it? It's good. So here's what he does. And so as he rises to power, he takes the empire greater than what his father did. Now, he didn't use any old means to do that. He used marriage.
Oh. How many times?
I don't have that number for you, but it was not his marriage.
Oh, okay.
Oh no. He made other people do that?
He did.
For 15 times.
He had daughters.
Oh, he married his daughters.
No.
No.
Ew.
No. issues, bro.
He took his daughters and he aligned them with other groups of people, and he promised them to be married to princes or kings of other countries in an effort to arrange that marriage for political gain for him and his country.
What if he liked his daughters?
Very wise.
Well, okay.
See that
So,
backfiring.
a lot of people don't give a crap. They literally marry for stuff like this all the time.
Well,
Not
you know, it's also important for us to understand that different cultures around the world at different points in history treat women differently. I'm not saying it's the right way. I'm not saying that I agree with what they did, but women were often used as negotiating tools or alliance deals. And so they would offer their daughter as a no, not a sacrifice.
No, basically. Wait, guys, you guys
As-
remember Mulan, right?
As a way.
That's what that was. That's
Oh
exactly
my
what that was.
god!
That's what
Yeah.
the three girls. That's why they couldn't. Yeah, exactly.
Mulan would be more
I want to be like
Far East Asia, but you could make the connection,
Same
sure.
concept. Yes, Haley. Yes.
Now, he took his daughters, he married them off. He also, when he ran out of daughters, he also used his sisters as negotiating tools to marry them off to grow the power of Russia.
What if they were already married?
They weren't.
You can't get
No.
married without your father's permission.
So, because
Eloping. Yeah, they couldn't.
Yeah. So because of his position as emperor, he would have had, if his sisters were not married, he would have had the ability to take his father's place and to go ahead and marry them off. That would have been fine. Under his leadership, Christianity prospers. This is Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and it flourishes in Russia there.
Flourishes means it does good, right?
Yes, it's
Does
doing very
well.
well.
Good, well seen.
No.
He also establishes a strict legal code for Russia and puts into place laws and government for everybody to follow. So this was a very good thing to make Russia a more modern society and a more organized society. He also helped establish the first library that Russia had ever seen. I know many of you do whatever you can to stay out of the library, but this was important for the future education and the advancement of their culture, especially in a time where the rest of Europe was struggling for education. They were struggling for literacy, where many people, they were over in France or what we would consider Germany today, they struggled to read, and yet we have people in Russia here that are building libraries and that are advancing their culture further than what we would have seen in Europe. Unfortunately, their society does not last forever. The Kievan society begins to decline. He makes a very big mistake. What was that mistake? After he gives up his power, he dies. What does he do, or what happens after his death?
Did he split his kingdom?
Bingo.
Between his daughter.
He split up his kingdom.
Women should not be ruling.
It never works.
It never works. You're absolutely right. I'm glad you observed that, because he had a number of sons. He splits up the empire and says, you can have this part of the empire, you can have this part of the empire, you get this part of the empire. And each of those sons had grown up in a privileged home. They'd grown up in the home of the royalty, home of the king, and they did not know how to rule. They did not have good discernment. And they end up wasting away their kingdom, making poor decisions, and
He was a bad father.
no, not necessarily.
It's more focused on politics.
So
I mean, if you don't teach your sons how to take over the country,
what if he did?
then they wouldn't have done
You said he
that.
didn't
At
grow
least
up in
one
10
of them would
different
be
homes.
Whoa. Hold on.
As a child.
How many times have we communicated certain rules or certain things through Scripture
Way too many.
that are neglected to be obeyed just in this classroom?
Ooh.
But isn't running a country like a little bit different than that? Like,
The principle remains the same though. If
I'm
he
just saying, like, you know, like following rules is different than governing a country. And like, if your dad says, okay, so like this is why we do what we do in this country, and like I get exploring other options to do things and ways to do things, but how many sons did he have?
I don't know how many sons he had.
They might think
Sure.
that their idea of running the country is better than what their father's idea. And they're
So
just-
here's a really important concept for us to understand just for life is that when you see somebody making poor decisions, it's their decision. We don't know what kind of education they had. And to be totally fair and honest, I don't know. You might be absolutely right. He might have done nothing to train his sons. But he also might have sent them to military school, and he might have taught them the best way to rule a country, and they didn't listen. It's, we are the same way where our parents tell us certain things, or, for me, when I hear pastor preach and he says, here's what the Word of God says, and I walk out and I say, yeah, I heard that, but I don't go out and practice it. And we're guilty of doing the same thing. And you say, well, it's different when it's a government and you're running a country. Maybe, but the principle still remains the same. It's your decision to follow the instruction given. Proverbs chapter 5 talks about, one of my favorite verses to bring up is, I have not obeyed the voice of my teachers nor inclined my ear to their instruction. And I think I may have used that last year at one point in geography, and just put that on the board and let you guys look that up. But that is something that you can't force somebody to obedience. You can lead them, but if they're not going to make that decision, then that's between them and God. So before we be too harsh on Yaroslav the Wise and the decline of the country, we need to look at those that were directly responsible. Now, yes, maybe he didn't do a good job of training his sons. I don't know. But we got to be careful about passing judgment. What did you find out?
I looked it up and it said he had 7 sons, and some of them should have been too young to rule when they got power.
Okay. All right, and that's part of where I don't know. Among those 7,
How many daughters did he have?
I don't know. Among those 7 and those that were too young, I don't know if they set up people to help them rule or whether they, how they would have established that. I can tell you what Europe most likely would have done, but as far as Russia, I'm not sure on that. Europe typically would have appointed a guidance counselor over top of them. That person would have made the decisions for him until he got to be a ruling age.
What is the ruling age?
Depends on the culture. Sometimes it was young as 7, sometimes it was 12, sometimes it was
7?
yeah.
Yeah, isn't like the youngest in the Bible, wasn't he like
Yep.
It gives me a list of his children.
Does it really? Cool.
Yeah.
What is it, like 5 pages long?
No.
he only had 10 kids?
No, if you were to look at it catalog, there would have been like a whole dictionary.
There you go. Let's talk Mongols here for a little bit.
He's not looking at you.
The Mongols are a warrior group that come from Central Asia.
Oh, no, it's Genghis.
One of his sons' name is Igor.
And
So these group of nomadic people, what do I mean by nomadic? Wanderers, yeah. So they're moving all around. They don't have a permanent home. They are originally from Central Asia, and they start to spread themselves out and start to go on the attack. And they go toward China and also go toward Europe as they try to expand and conquer different territories. They also end up conquering some of the Islamic territory. The Mongols really go all over the place. This is one of the largest empires and largest armies in history. They had an extremely large land army that could overwhelm almost any culture. Except for what? Yeah, we're not really using a whole lot of those anymore. No.
no more 300?
No.
You know what else?
So do the horses they're using.
Okay, let's not argue.
Horses now?
Let's not argue. Let's not argue. So the empire was built under the leadership of Temujin.
I'm sorry. That's not her name.
Now, this is his birth name, and he, guys, let's refocus. He helped to unite all of the Mongol tribes and get them together so that they could be an empire, so that they could go off and conquer other people. So his big claim to fame is that he unites them to begin with. Now, he is going to take on another name, which he is more famous, and that is Genghis Khan.
Oh.
Wow, that's like cheating.
Now, Genghis Khan, his name means universal ruler. So Genghis Khan is the universal ruler. He unified the Mongolian people. He got them organized. And then went out and began to conquer most of Asia. He went into northern China. He also went into parts of Central Asia, Persia, Russia, and just goes all over the place conquering people with his massive army. Let's talk about that army here for a moment. The Mongol army had incredible speed. One of the greatest armies that we will talk about when we get to the 20th century is the German army and their Blitzkrieg. And so this was like the early predecessor to the Blitzkrieg. Okay, Blitzkrieg is translated the lightning war. You watch any football, you hear the term the defense is going to blitz. Well, that's where that term comes from because it's like an all-out attack going off after people. That was the German approach in World War I, and they went on to World War II as well. This is the Mongolian version of that. Their army was so fast. They were a quick strike. They're going to punch you, knock you out, and make sure that they attack before you have a chance to get your defenses up. And they were incredibly fast. They were expert horsemen, which a lot of armies did not use horses at this time. There were some that did, but many of which, if they did, they were not as well trained as what the Mongols were. And so when we get to 1240, the grandson of Genghis Khan, his name was Batu Khan, he goes in and he conquers the city of Kiev. And they take over Russia. So we just talked about the rule of the Russian Empire. Of course, we mentioned how they split and divided their empire. Well, as they split their empire, that became an opportunity for the Mongols and Batu Khan to go in there and to take over Russia. Yes, ma'am.
So does Batu take charge of Genghis?
Yeah, he's going to take over leadership from Genghis Khan. This is his grandson, and he's going to now run things similar to the way that Genghis had run it.
Like forcefully?
Yeah, pretty forcefully. Yeah, he is a military wizard, military genius, and does a great job of leading that military. This is not a date that I'm going to require that you memorize, but again, this gives you perspective. We talked about the establishment of Russia in 840, I think we said. Well, by 1240 now, it's being demolished by the Mongols. When the Mongols come in and destroy Kiev, they left a couple of witnesses to be able to go tell people what had happened, and the quote that came back was that no eye was left to weep. That's how brutal this slaughter was of Kiev. And people began to reference this army as the Golden Horde. So gold is the color for royalty. And as you would look out over the countryside, if the Mongols were camped in their tents, many of their tents were made out of animal skin. As the sun came up and rose over top of those tents, it would glisten off of those tents, giving it a golden color to the dome of those tents. Actually, not always tents, but the canvas. So then the horde was a word for camp. And so you'd see that out in the distance, and you know that your end is imminent, that it is on its way. Yeah,
I'm good. Oh, let's go, man. Let's leave.
Like, oh man, guess what?
Got a blast.
this is not a army I want to fight.
Mr. Jones, if that happened to you, you pull adjusting.
I probably would. It's hard to say while I'm standing here in my air-conditioned classroom, but
Mr. Jones, could they just put up like, I know they didn't have barbed wire, but like something like barbed wire, like, or like trenches or something like that.
They had swords.
I know, but they could have built something like that.
They
These-
literally stood no chance. And
the-
doing that
yeah.
would take more time and energy.
so I don't know whether we're going to have time today, but if not today, on Thursday we'll watch a little video here on the Mongols, and John Green's going to inform us a little bit of their army and what's going on there. And it's you don't stand a whole lot of chance against the Mongols. If they're that close, you can see them. You're already dead.
I'm trying to listen to the teachers.
Yeah.
Please be quiet.
So-
Everybody ran a different way.
Like, why-
Where are you going to go?
No, I think you're-
Yeah, that's a problem. I mean, you're right. You could try to escape, but you have nowhere to go. Well, the Mongols are going to bring their rule into Russia. Once they conquer Kiev, they're going to establish their own rule here. So they went to the other cities in the neighborhood, and they allowed the Russians to continue life as usual under Mongolian authority as long as they did not rebel. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of the way that Rome came in and conquered their people and then said, okay, we're your new authority. As long as you don't cause any trouble, then continue living life as normal. And the Mongols did that here in Russia. Now, they did have a few demands. You had to have absolute obedience. Don't question. And then you had to pay tribute to the Mongols through the form of taxes, through the form of honor.
I wonder where they got
Respect.
that idea.
Yeah, I don't question that either. And at first the Russians said, no way, however you'd say that in Russian. And they did not want to fall under the rule of Mongols. They wanted to be self-ruled, and they wanted to have life their own way. However, Alexander Nevsky stands up to his own people in Russia, and Alexander Nevsky says, hold on, people, just wait a second. Do you see the Mongols and what they did to Kiev? Do you see Batu Khan and the brutal force that they have out there? We don't stand a chance. So here's what I'm going to suggest that we do. Let's cooperate with the Mongols. Let's do what they say. Let's be their friends so they don't kill us. Now, you may not like it, but it's a way to survive. And Alexander Nevsky stands up to his own people, and he preserves the Russian people from getting totally annihilated because they would have rebelled. They did not want to go along with this idea, but Nevsky convinces them this is the best way to survive and hopefully at some point be able to regain their freedom. Now, in the end, it led to Russia becoming isolated from the rest of the world and being cut off from most of Europe. And this is part of the reason why when we talk about the European Dark Ages, Middle Ages, we talk about the Crusades, we'll talk about castles and kings and those type of things. We don't talk a lot about Russia because Russia is largely forgotten about during this time. And Russia, while they were more advanced than Europe through much of the Middle Ages, by the time we get here to the Mongolian rule, they begin to fall backward in education. They begin to lose some of their knowledge and their culture because of their isolation. So as Europe is waking up through the Renaissance and the Reformation, Russia is still asleep because they're cut off from the rest of the world. China is actually pretty similar in that as well. But that's for another day to talk about. Why?
He said so.
Well, China believes themselves to be the best culture in the world, and so they don't want to be influenced by somebody else. That's like, yeah. So again, that's understanding more about the Chinese culture than what we have time to talk about today. We'll get there at another point. Now, Russia's going to break free from Mongolian rule here. Moscow becomes the main city in Russia. And they had a number of powerful princes. Now, under the Mongolian rule, the Mongols kind of let the Russians begin to have some freedoms, and they allowed them to have some self-government. And so those self-governing people were called princes. Ivan I was one of those princes. And he stepped in, and he stopped the Russians from revolting against the Mongols. Very similar to the way Alexander Nevsky stopped a revolt and said, hey, let's be friendly. Ivan I stops a Russian revolt. Says, we don't want to do this now. We need to continue to be friendly with the Mongols. And because of this, the Mongols said, hey, you're a pretty good guy. Thanks for helping us out there. So we're going to promote you. And we're going to give you the title of Grand Prince. Oh, hey, that's pretty cool. I get to be a Grand Prince. I don't know what that means, but I get to be a Grand Prince. He earns the trust of the Mongol people. And this begins the process of moving to Moscow. It's a good thing it's Yeah. 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 So Ivan I convinces the patriarch from Kiev to move to Moscow.
I bet it's for Libby.
I'm going to guess you're right.
How much more are you doing?
No, Libby, don't leave. Just kidding, bye.
Yeah, Libby, this is for you.
How much more are you
Sorry
doing
to
of
get
the
to
notes?
We have still a little ways to go today. So I'll have this posted today, this afternoon or tomorrow. That way you can catch up on it. So, we'll give you a chance to go. So they moved the church capital from Kiev here to Moscow. And eventually they begin to build up a stronghold around Moscow. And Moscow becomes the central hub of Russian culture under the rule of Ivan. And they start to gain more power and more control centered here in Moscow. And this is where the empire begins to emerge. We fast forward ahead a few years until we have the rule of Ivan III. And Ivan III, by this point, had now gained more power, and he took the title Tsar. Tsar.
You were so extra.
This is the Russian term for Caesar. Oh, we recognize the name Caesar, don't we? Yeah. So he calls himself Tsar. He is a Russian, views himself as a Russian Caesar, and he begins the process of breaking away from the Mongols. He is. Yeah, I believe it's grandson, if I remember right. Don't quote me on that because I didn't write that down, but I think it's somewhere in that neighborhood. So the final breakaway from the Mongols actually becomes a bloodless standoff to where the Mongols and the Russians go head-to-head near the Angara River. That river is not necessarily significant for what we're studying here, but we have the Mongols on one side, we have the Russians over here, and it looks like they're going to go to major war. And the Mongols look across the river at the Russians, they look at the power they have, they look at the history, and they go, you know what, I'm not sure Russia's really worth it anymore. We're just going to back away and let them have their country back. That's how it happened. For as brutal and as fierce as the Mongols were, By the time we get here to Ivan III, the Mongols are on the decline. They're not as powerful as what they once were. They now have interest in other places around the world. Russia's no longer a key stronghold for them, and so they just decide to bow out peacefully, no fighting happens, and the Mongols leave. Russia now is their own independent country.